Now you're not going to believe me when I tell you that I first met this guy, 2002, 2003, when we were both engaged principally at the time with the question of underage gambling
Yes.
on the internet. Yeah. And
almost as long ago as the millennium.
Yeah, that's it. This is not
that either of us look old enough.
No, that's true. Yeah, it's been a long journey to get to this point today. But anyway, PASS is certainly one of the first sort of age verification schemes.
Very much so, yeah.
At scale, operational within the UK. And you've been CEO pretty much from the beginning, if not literally.
Entirely from the beginning, yes. I've not moved up once in the entire time.
You could call yourself emperor now, if you
want. Yeah.
So go ahead, Andrew.
Wouldn't dream of doing that, especially when I'm in the room with the winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award. Robin, congratulations. Good to see you here. It means a lot that the Chief Exec of Yoti is coming to hear what I've got to say. So good morning, a select and august group. But yeah, I really want to talk about something completely different, which is that there's lots of really clever people here with lots of big financial, looking at how we can make it all seamless and easy for all the people in the world who've got smartphones and photo ID to be able to interact with government and public services and private services more and more easily. And obviously lots of innovation. But there is a group of people, a really big group of people who are at risk of losing out. And what I'm here in the next 20 minutes to talk about is an idea, and it is just an idea. It's a concept which I wanted to float this morning and see whether there are any nibbles, any interest. And it's something which for the time being we're calling Access ID. It's not something we've built, it's just an idea. But the word access is precisely about letting everyone on the planet access the benefits and wonders that digital inclusion offers. Where did this idea come from? Well, my experience for the last 27 years, scarily, has been running an ID scheme in the UK. And in the UK, still, there are 2 million people who have absolutely no ID whatsoever. It's about 5% of the electorate, 5% of people entitled to vote and be part of our democratic process. And that's why in 2024, the year of the general election, I was really pleased when my board of directors signed off on us doing our biggest ever offer of free photo ID cards. And as a result, it's no exaggeration to say that we helped 250,000 people to vote in the UK general election. Now, I'm led to believe it wasn't a wafer-thin result. And it might be that 250,000 wouldn't have made a difference. But just the fact that we helped 250,000 people in the UK exercise their democratic franchise is something that I and the rest of the team, frankly, feel really good about. And that is what inclusion is about. And a citizen card, which at its simplest is just a piece of plastic, but it's a valid government-recognized, police-recognized photo ID, helps people to vote. And after 26 years, this year for the first time, use in the nighttime economy in bars, pubs and clubs is not the number one reason why people get a card from us. The number one reason why people get a card from us is to vote. And that's quite something. And I'm mindful of that ahead of local elections coming up in May in England, for which you need voter ID, whereas for the Parliament elections in Scotland and the Senate elections in Wales, you do not need voter ID. That's a discussion for another time. A long time ago, the United Nations issued a strategic development goal. It's precisely strategic development goal 16.9, that by 2030, everyone should have legal identity. And I'm afraid 2030 is not that far away, and we're not gonna get there. The figures are quite staggering. I put on my slide here, 800 million people have no ID. The World Bank's ID for D program says it's 850 million. I guess no one's counting precisely, 850 billion. The World Bank goes on to say that 3.3 billion people do not have access to any form of digital ID. So the issue here is all the people who are going to miss this great digital ride. More than half of those who don't have ID at all are children whose births haven't even been registered. More than half of the people with no ID at all live south of the Sahara. The people most at risk of exclusion: children without birth registration, women in low-income countries, adults in rural areas, adults who only have primary schooling or not even that, and adults who are out of work. These are the groups who are most at risk. And why it matters, and what are the reasons why people don't have access to ID. The distance to register. If the registration office is in Kampala, but you're 50 miles away, and your only transport option is your feet, you ain't going to register. Document requirements. People won't be given ID unless they have ID. You need a birth certificate, for example, to get a photo ID. But if you don't have a birth certificate, you're not going to get the photo ID. And in many places, the cost is a barrier. You need ID, you're told you need ID, but it's going to cost what? An hour's wages, a day's wages, a week's wages. You probably have more important things to do with the money. What can you then not do with the ID? You can't get a SIM or mobile service, so you become less communicative. You can't vote. 37% of the people without ID, as a result, cannot vote. You can't use finance, you can't open a bank account, you can't get credit, you can't get support from government, you can't get a job, because everybody needs to know who you are. At worst, more than a quarter of people without ID are blocked from getting access to medical care. So literally, at its worst and most extreme, people without ID probably are more likely to die. That's the barrier. What do we do about this? What is the leapfrog moment? And by leapfrog, what I mean is the opportunity to help these people, wherever they are in the world, to get some form of ID, their first ID, a first step on the ladder. And I think what we need to do is work collaboratively. We need to set up a non-profit global foundation. It's as simple and as hard as that. We need something that sets a global trust layer, that sets assurance levels, a credential schema, a simple verification API. But and this is the critical point, the reality of how this works on the ground is it has to be local. It has to be national governance, because how you do this in Canada is going to be a world away from how you do it in Uganda. But actually both countries, as I'll come on to talk to, matter. And the outcomes are twofold. You give everyone a physical ID because it's very possibly their first physical ID. And in a world where they might not have a phone, or if they have a phone, it might not be smart enough for a digital credential, or they might not have access always to power the phone. So some kind of trusted physical ID matters, more so in the countries where people are most at risk of being excluded. You also overlay that with the digital credential. So what I'm talking about here is a combination of the physical and the digital everywhere. It's a thin global layer, the minimum level of what you need to do at the global level, and a maximum local adaptation. You do this as far as possible locally. The assurance framework obviously has to be worked up. This isn't it set in stone, but this is simply to give you an idea of what you set as the common standard globally and where you go from. Level 1, the minimum applicable to an identity assurance level of 1, that would be typically taking someone's photograph and matching the photo to a vouch from a trusted referee, 1 or 2 referees. Level 2 takes you further because you're adding maybe an expired document, a utility bill, or a school or medical record, and a vouch from someone at the school or the hospital or the GP surgery. That takes you to level 2. Level 3 gets you up further because you're then linking someone to a government issued document like a passport or a driving license, or absent those documents, some biometric binding, the combination of face matching and liveness. And then, of course, finally, the government issued ID. This is not an attempt to replace or compete with what government's doing. This is an attempt to provide an initial overlay to help people who have nothing to get something and give them the opportunity to build up. And what these individuals have is an access ID record that may start off at level 0. But over time, they have the opportunity to build it up and work towards at least level 3 or level 4. And of course, the relying parties, wherever they may be and whatever they are, whether they are a shop, a bank, a credit union, a health system, an education service, or anything else, will choose and will know what the level is. So it's not about you've either got an access ID, physical or digital card, or you haven't. It's, yes, you will have that, but it's about what is the assurance level behind it. Where do we do this? How do we start this? The honest answer is you have to start somewhere. And why not be ambitious? Because one of the things you want to prove on such an exercise as this is that you can do it in a range of different types of country. I've picked 8 for no other reason than that they're actually all very different from each other. And if we can prove that this works in these 8, then the other 187 countries logically follow. The reasoning, and this is not necessarily in order of how I would suggest you do the pilots. Obviously, that's for whatever group is formed to develop this to give some thought to. But Brazil is an obvious candidate. We've heard a lot about Brazil already at this summit. It's a country with a big population. 40% of the workforce are informal. Everyone in theory has a CPF, the tax ID card, which that's an image of. And there are also state IDs, but those are state IDs for the different states within Brazil. And a very large number of Brazilians, even if they've got a CPF, do not have a state ID. There's an opportunity for Access ID to come into a country that needs a national solution to support what government is doing. The United States, hard to ignore. The point about the United States is there is no national ID scheme across the whole country, of course. So the opportunity is to bring in an ID that will work across state lines, and again, that works with federal and state governments, recognizing the success of many local ID schemes. In New York City, for example, the New York City card is actually very successful. It's run locally. The way you can get the card is multifold. You don't need a passport. You don't need a state driving license. There are many ways you can get the New York identity card. And yet, a lot of New York's working population, of course, is itinerant. And the New York ID card, although well promoted in New York, is recognized absolutely nowhere else, not even across the river in New Jersey. So the opportunity in the States is to, for example, do a pilot with an NGO in LA County, reaching communities that currently have no or little usable ID. Work in New York to plug the gap and improve the uptake of New York's own ID card. But by issuing an Access ID, you're using something that over time is usable theoretically in every state. I hesitate to say how many that is because I'm never quite sure whether it's 50 or 51, whether you should include Puerto Rico, is DC included? Anyway, the point being that you can have a national solution there. Canada. Canada matters not because of size. The population is nothing compared to the southern neighbor. But in Canada, communities have more control over their data than almost any other jurisdiction. And the ownership, control, access, possession organization of the First Nation communities in Canada absolutely epitomizes the fact that no Canadian government, not even a state government, can mandate ID. It's up to the communities themselves. Put bluntly, if we can work with First Nation communities in Canada to help plug the gap where too many of their citizens don't have any ID and give them ID that they in the community are driving, then that shows that even in a country as data sovereign as Canada, we can make this work. And yes, the First Nation Canadian who has an Access ID card, it's functionally and physically the same Access ID card that we issue everywhere else. And They're all usable and transportable and portable. But this is about maximizing the issuance to communities that are the hardest to reach. In Australia, unsurprisingly, we would work specifically with the Aboriginal communities, Torres Strait Islanders. These are some of the communities most off the grid in terms of data. And in a country like Australia and New Zealand, national ID exists, but it doesn't recognize everyone. And so again, much like Canada, we need to work with the communities. It needs to be community-led. For Access ID to work in these countries, it has to be community-led. New Zealand, working with the Maori community, again, they have a data sovereignty network that manages and controls Maori citizens' data. Very important you work with these communities and pilot in these areas. India, huge population, huge national ID. A couple of people said, "Oh, India, Andrew, really? Very, very tough market." I said, it's not about a market. We're not trying to go in there and run an ID scheme for India. They have one. But not everyone is in the program. Again, for all the reasons you would expect. High mobility, urban labor corridors, such as parts of Delhi, places even as technically relatively advantaged as Bengaluru, opportunities to work with local groups and get more of the population in there. This is the point of Access ID, not working against or instead of what government's doing, but working as an overlay to improve the uptake. The mission here is to get more of that 850 million people who have nothing, something. Get them somewhere on that identity assurance ladder to begin with. Indonesia, astonishing country. I was there a few weeks ago, and it's 17,000 islands for a start. It's a huge population. And clearly what you do in some of the outlying islands is going to be very different in practice to what you're going to do in Jakarta. Everyone in theory has an NIK, the national insurance number, and there is a national ID scheme in Indonesia. But 40% of Indonesians are not in it. 40%. How does a government do a national ID scheme that nearly 4 in 10 of its citizens are not part of? And this is the thing. It's easy, and we spend so much time at this summit and elsewhere exploring all the great, crazy ways to link banks and people and phones. And for everyone who's got all of that, the people with the bank accounts, the people with the passports, the photo driving licenses, the smartphones, the latest Apple download, whatever, great. But this is about a project to do something about the 850 million people. Uganda, obviously, that earlier stat about the proportion of people with no ID south of the Sahara. Uganda's probably one of the perfect size places to do a pilot, sub-Sahara. You have a large peri-urban population, people who live in the countryside come into the city just to work. And again, it's a country that, in theory, it has an ID scheme. There's a national ID rollout in Uganda, but a third of Ugandans, 35% on the last reckoning, are not part of Uganda's national ID scheme. 35%. Can Access ID do something to help bring people out of the ID darkness and begin that journey? That is the vision. So governance. Obviously, if we're going to do this, governance of this is going to be really important. A non-profit foundation, a worldwide board with representatives from all the countries, at least, that are involved in the pilot phase. And I think we need to do something like 7 or 8 pilot countries to give it a kind of global viability. And precisely because what's going to work in Brazil is not the same as what's going to work in Australia. We need local trust domains, community representation, absolutely essential. We won't get anywhere in Canada with the First Nation communities unless we're working with their representatives and that they are actually running and leading this and determining the how as well as the when and the where. Independent standards, ethics, privacy oversight are given, and that can be applied on a global layer. What do we need? We need support from governments. We need support from NGOs. We need support from any of you who are in any way inspired or excited by the opportunity here. I don't believe, and I might be wrong, that there's anyone else at the summit proposing this. And this is not something that is for Andrew Chevis to run or for Citizencard to run. It's nothing to do with that. I'm almost in a private capacity here, just setting out a vision. And I'm certainly not thinking that I'm clever enough to pull this off by myself. But what I am doing is a shout out and the start of a conversation. I'm heartened by the number of you I've already spoken with before this morning's presentation about the idea and wanting to talk about it further. I think it's an exciting opportunity. The possibility of a global trust layer that applied locally helps get some 100 million. Let's set ourselves a really reasonable target, 100 million out of the 850 million with no ID. That would be an achievement. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think I'll volunteer to do the project in Brazil, by the way, if you're looking for somebody.
We will need people everywhere, John. But
so, questions.
Thank you for offering to go to Sao Paulo.
Ian?
That's the second time you've tried to get a trip to Brazil after the stops and stuff. Did it with the regulator yesterday. Andrew, that's great. And thank you for, as they say in the House of Commons, advanced notice of your statement. One suggestion, which I think is, you mentioned the IAL standards at sort of bottom of the slide about the different levels. I think it's probably, there's an exercise to be done in mapping against the various international standards that are around
against NIS, against IDAS, all of them.
Because the more you can kind of align with a consensus around them all, the easier it is, because people will already be working to those standards.
100%. I wanted to keep it simple for the presentation, but of course what you want to do is make sure that it maps closely with NIST if you're wanting to do things in North America. Of course we want to, I haven't included Europe in the proposed pilots because Europe is one of the parts of the world actually where there's probably the least amount of ID exclusion, because most Europeans' births are registered. Most Europeans do have some form of ID. Most European countries, nearly all of them, do national ID that works.
Yes, although they obviously have quite a few people who turn up on boats and may not. So I think there's probably still some work there. Yeah. But then my other point was, I maybe I'm lobbing a bit here, but I think there should be a compulsion on any platform that is requiring digital identity, or in our area, age verification, to make it an inclusive and accessible process. And I think that somehow requires us coming up with a way to cross-subsidize a bit from the cheap checks to pay for the difficult checks, which are going to be much more expensive, whether that's around age or identity. I wondered what you thought about that concept.
Yeah, so I actually had a really interesting chat yesterday on the phone with someone a long way away from the Carnegie Foundation, who I'm busy buttering up, as possibly someone who might be interested in helping bring this and get this going. And we ended up at the idea that, and this is just a global average, so about $3 to actually validate someone who currently has nothing. $3 is a global average. And anyone using the Access ID API, which would be made available to everyone globally to validate anyone who's in the Access ID system, at about 3 cents a pop. Now, obviously, for that to balance, you've got to imagine that the person who's got the Access ID, how many times are they going to be, verified at 3 cents a pop? But that's probably the scale of it. But honestly, numbers on the back of a fag packet probably is the right way to describe that conversation. But nonetheless, that's where we landed. And I don't think $3 a pop to get someone in, as it were, to onboard someone onto Access ID is a global average cost. Bearing in mind the whole thing is going to be community-led. You're going to get a lot of people in the local communities doing this. They're not going to be charging expensive consultant rates. It's not half the people who are at this summit on expenses who'll be doing it. And that's the truth of it. That's why I think it's not unreasonable to think in terms of, can we get 100 million people ID'd? Just don't give me a timeline on when I expect to hit that figure.
Right, thanks. Any other questions or comments? No? Great. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
By the way, the organisers of this event have asked me to encourage everybody to give some feedback, in particular about the venue where we've been, the conference.